let's talk about the spinal cord and spinal nerves. This will give us our introduction to this portion of the central nervous system. So, first thing that we should recognize is that the spinal cord runs down through the vertebral canal. Now, we've studied the vertebral column already. You know that each one of the 24 individual vertebrae sit atop one another. All of their vertebral foramina line up to literally create a tube running down through the vertebral column. That tube-like structure then is filled with the spinal cord. That hollow space runs all the way down into the sacral canal and down to the sacral hiatus here. So you've got this long tube, and the spinal cord is there, protected by the bones. What most people don't know is that the spinal cord is not as long as most people think in an adult. The spinal cord in an adult is finished at about L1 in your vertebral column. So it doesn't run all the way down into your sacrum. In you and I, it's just about the tip of the spinal cord is right about there. Now what's even more interesting is that it is or appears to be much longer in an infant. In an infant that's born, the spinal cord inhabits the entire vertebral canal, all the way down into the sacrum. So why this change? Well, you should probably recognize that when a child is born, the head is proportionally big, right? It's sort of out of size with the rest of the body. In fact, if you're an artist and you want to kind of get everything in proportion, an infant's head is usually about a quarter of the size of its whole body. If you look at an adult, how much is the size of your head related to your whole body? Well, it's more like a sixth or a seventh of the size of your whole body. A fetus in the womb, early on, its head is half the size of its body. So the head, basically because the brain and the spinal cord, the central nervous system, grows very rapidly. If you remember fetal circulation, remember there was this advantage of pumping more oxygen to the head end of the body up over the aortic arch because of those different bypasses within fetal circulation. So a child is born with a pretty robust nervous system. And this is what's going to govern its life early on. Everything else can catch up. It doesn't matter if a child can walk or not when it's born. You know, some animals come out of the womb ready to walk. You know, they get up on their feet very, very quickly. Much of our human body just takes time to develop. So the central nervous system is about the size that it's going to be when you're an adult, when you're born. A little diagram of that would look like this, maybe if this is sort of a child. Let's watch a child grow. The spinal cord is not shrinking, right? The rest of the body is outgrowing it, isn't it? The spinal cord grows very little. The spinal cord in the brain grows very little, while the rest of the body grows a whole lot. And so it winds up looking like, oh, did my spinal cord shrink? No, it didn't. It was growing a little bit, but not as much as the rest of the body. And that leaves the spinal cord then up here, the end of the spinal cord, up at about L1 in your vertebral canal. If you compare this to the child, you can see that the spinal cord's about the same size. The body's just bigger. What else had to grow bigger from the child to the adult? What else of the nervous system grew bigger? You can see it in those two diagrams. Compare those two. In the nervous system, what else grew bigger or longer in the diagram? What does this yellow thing represent? A nerve, right? The nerves have to lengthen along with the body. As the body grows, right, the nerves have to lengthen. At At this stage, when you're a child, the nerves are coming straight out of the vertebra. But when you get to be an adult, the spinal cord is up here, so the nerves are running down through that remaining portion of the vertebral canal and out to the various places. There are a number of features in the spinal cord that we should be able to describe. The spinal cord comes down and just tapers and tapers into a little cone-shaped area. This is called the conus medullaris, or in English, some people call it the medullary cone. But it's the final little tapering tip of the spinal cord. This is what you'd find at about the L1 vertebra. The nerves that have come out of the spinal cord that run down through the vertebral canal and exit through their various foramina are referred to as the cauda equina. The cauda equina. Here's a picture that's got a little more detail in it than this other one. You can see here would be the conus medullaris right here, and nerves that are coming off from here are running down through the rest of the vertebral canal and still connected out. At one time when you were an infant, this was down here, and so the nerves were coming straight out of the holes. But as this whole channel, this whole canal gets longer and longer, the nerves have to run down and out. And so the nerves occupy, the spinal nerves that exit lower down occupy that vertebral canal, and they're referred to as the cauda equina. Do you know what those two words mean? Equina, from the word equestrian. The genus name of an animal is equus. What animal? A horse, right? And cauda is tail. So this is named the horse's tail, literally, right? If you know a horse's tail, there's very little vertebral structure in a horse's tail, right? The vertebral structure of a horse's tail is typically shorter than a cat or a dog. But that vertebral structure there has all these long, long hairs coming down from it. And back when these things were named, there were no automobiles, there were no airplanes. This was hundreds and hundreds of years ago when people put names to these things. So they picked things out of nature that looked like what they were seeing in the human body. And all of these little nerve strands running down through the rest of this vertebral canal looked like a horse's tail to somebody. And so they gave it the Latin name cauda equina. Yeah. So the what? Yeah, so you've got a vertebral canal that runs from your skull to the sacral hiatus, right? But when the body outgrows the spinal cord, you don't lose that canal. The canal is still there, but now it's occupied by the nerves that are running down through and exiting. It looks a little bit like this. These are a couple of other pictures that I could find. Like this is from Gray's Anatomy, the book that's been around for 100 years, sort of the Bible of human anatomy. And you can see up here the conus medullaris, and here are the nerves that would have been coming out in this lumbar area, but now that the tube is longer than the spinal cord, these nerves coming out have to travel down through the vertebral canal to be connected out their various openings. Or this little picture kind of shows that. Here would be the conus medullaris. Here's the spinal cord, conus medullaris. Here are the nerves coming out. These from up here are connected out there, though. These from here are running down and connecting out through here, right? So this is that cauda equina down in the inferior parts of the vertebral canal. Okay? So that's cauda equina. What it is just these nerve strands that are still exiting from the spinal cord up here, but have to exit the vertebral canal down where they were originally connected out. The nerves, these spinal nerves, grow longer and longer. As the body grows longer and longer, the nerves have to grow longer and longer. So that's cauda equina. Okay, so cauda equina, conus medullaris, those are two real significant features. Notice that the spinal cord is enlarged in a couple of places. Up here in the cervical area, the spinal cord is wider. There is more tissue there. In the lumbosacral area of the spinal cord, where the lumbar and sacral nerves come out, the spinal cord is enlarged. There's more tissue here than there is through the thoracic area. Now realize this lumbosacral enlargement is not down here in the lumbosacral area anymore. It's up here, but its nerves are still connected out through those holes. This is where the lumbar and sacral nerves come out. Why are those two areas enlarged? Why are they bigger than they would be otherwise? Are there more nerves here, more nerve structure, more to do from this lumbosacral area? Yes, there is, because all of the nerves for all of your entire lower limb is coming out of here. And again, likewise, up in the cervical area, that's where the brachial plexus is, and all the brachial plexus nerves, all the nerves for your arms and your shoulder. So there's a lot more activity to feed nerves to, a lot more structure to feed nerves to in the cervical and lumbar area. Think about the thoracic area for just a moment. In your thoracic area, how much structure is there here? There are ribs and there are muscles between the ribs, right? So, and you've got a nerve for each rib. Do you remember the posterior intercostal nerves? Please tell me you remember that. Reach back. Remember our cat dissection? Right? And there was a nerve for every rib. So they're pretty tight together. So all a single nerve here has to do is just go out and feed a couple of muscles and bring some sensation back from a little strip of skin. That's not a whole lot when you've got a whole series of nerves for all of the skin in your lower limb, all the muscles in your lower limb. There's a lot of nerves, right, weaving themselves into a plexus and coordinating and controlling all of the lower or the upper limb. So the spinal cord is enlarged in these two places where the limbs connect back in. And then finally here, the filum terminale here is a little bit of connective tissue that anchors the conus medullaris down into the sacrum. And if I could tell you a little secret, that stuff right there is really pia mater and arachnoid mater, right? When the spinal cord was all the way down here, it had pia and arachnoid over it. But as the body outgrew it, those inner parts of the meninges, right, stayed attached where they were down here, but as the spinal cord seemed to shrink, it's not shrinking, the rest of it outgrew it, those connective tissues of the pia and arachnoid stay there and stay together, and they continue to anchor the conus medullaris down into the sacrum. So it's kind of like a little guy wire just holding the spinal cord straight and in line within the spinal cord. Filum terminale. Okay? You're going to see that indicated. It runs up between the strands of the cauda equina, but I'm usually going to point down a little lower so that you can distinguish that from the cauda equina. Okay? Questions so far? Good. So these are major structural characteristics of the spinal cord that we can see from this aspect. We also want to look at the spinal cord in cross-section then. If I slice through the spinal cord, what do I see? And again, I'm not dealing with the tissues yet. We're just kind of looking at the overall structure of the spinal cord. What strikes me here is that the spinal cord is deeply, deeply divided into two halves. Here in the front, well, just before I get to that, here's that central canal, right? Remember that? We just got through talking about that with the cerebrospinal fluid. Right? There's this little tube from the fourth ventricle running all the way down through the spinal cord to the conus medullaris, and the fluid is leaking out there into the subarachnoid space. So in a cross-section like this, you can identify that central canal. Now, the other thing that I was just saying is the spinal cord is deeply divided. So here in the front especially, there's an anterior median fissure. The meninges are actually going to fold their way down into that. On the posterior side, there's a posterior median sulcus. You remember the sulci from the brain, same term we can use in the spinal cord for smaller, just invaginations of the surface of the tissue. But if you look at both these lines, see how they pinch the spinal cord very, very deep. There's just a little bit of connecting tissue. It's very much like I have two separate spinal cords. And what makes this interesting is that my entire central nervous system tends to be divided into two halves. You saw how deeply divided the cerebrum was. This week in lab, we're going to look at the diencephalon. The diencephalon is deeply divided into two halves. The cerebellum bulges into two parts. There's a little more connection within the cerebellum, but it's still very deeply divided. About the only thing in the central nervous system that at least looks unified is the brainstem. Why do I have two nervous systems, really, structurally, instead of one? What is the advantage to having two cerebral hemispheres? Right brain and left brain. A right spinal cord and left spinal cord. A right diencephalon, left diencephalon. A right cerebellum and left cerebellum. This is one of the sort of wonders and mysteries of the central nervous system, of our nervous system as a whole. Why do we have this separation? But it's interesting that the spinal cord is right in line with everything else, deeply divided into two parts. This part would have all the nerve connections to one side of your body. This would have all the nerve connections to the other side. We can also see the formation of the spinal nerves here. And you can see that there are thousands of little rootlets that come out from the surface of the spinal cord that are going to ultimately form the spinal nerves. And there are a set of rootlets that come out and back and a set that come out in front. The rootlets form themselves into what we call roots. You can see there are two major roots here. And then those two roots unite, and that's where we see that spinal nerve that we've talked about and seen. If you remember the vertebral columns that we were studying, those little yellow spinal nerves that were coming out. A little more complicated when you get inside here. Spinal nerves are run all the way up and down the spinal cord. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves from what would be the C1 spinal nerve all the way down to the S5 spinal nerve. There are a few coccygeal nerves, but we're not going to talk about those right now. I just want to focus on the spinal nerves that are here. 31 pairs. When we look at these spinal nerves and their rootlets, we're going to name these two roots right here that form the spinal nerve. The one on the posterior aspect is called the dorsal root, and the one on the anterior aspect, where the rootlets come out from the anterior side, is going to be called the ventral root. So a dorsal root and a ventral root formed by rootlets forms the spinal nerve. Here's sort of a cutaway view of that in an actual picture. If you look closely here, here's the spinal cord, and you can see all the little rootlets coming out, and they're just a regular order of rootlets all the way down. What's interesting, though, is many, many rootlets from here to here then all cluster together into this root right here, and then the very next little rootlet is going to go down and cluster with all these little rootlets. And so you got all these little rootlets, but it's kind of like forming pigtails, right? If you made a bunch of little pigtails all the way down your head, it'd be kind of like that. Gather these strands of hair and make this root. Gather these strands and make this root. And so you've got all these rootlets forming themselves into these roots all the way down the spinal cord. So the information that's being transferred is coming out in these tiny little packets, but they all congeal into these roots and finally into the spinal nerve. So that's the structure of the formation. Now, if you follow the spinal nerve as it comes out, it's then going to branch. We've kind of treated spinal nerves as individual things, but you need to see that these spinal nerves have branches to them. Here's a picture of a short portion of the spinal cord. This is in the thoracic area, right? You can see the nerves running out here, which would be running around with the ribs, right? So the back area here where the spinal cord is would be dorsal. This would be coming around to the ventral side of you here. You can see the little rootlets. If you follow the rootlets over, there are two little roots formed, and then they form into the spinal nerve. And those would be about where the intervertebral foramina would be, right? The little holes on the side of the vertebra where the spinal nerve comes out. And so obviously this is where the spinal nerves are, both sides. So all of this rootlet structure is sort of inside the vertebral area, and the spinal nerve is what I see coming out. Now what happens as the spinal nerve exits from that foramina, spinal nerves branch 2 or 3 times. Some areas of the spinal cord, there's just 2 branches, some there are 3. 2 of the branches are always there. They're there throughout the entire spinal cord. But in one segment of the spinal cord, there's a 3rd branch that comes off as well. So let's look at these. The first branch to talk about is this dorsal ramus. And ramus, again, is a word for a branch, isn't it? Right? A ramus is a branch. So I can see this very, very strong branch here, and the dorsal ramus you can see is arching into my back. Now, why would a nerve be going into my back? Well, it could bring sensation from the skin on my back, right? Are there any muscles in my back? A few? A lot? We're going to see that in a minute. The other major branch here is the ventral ramus. This is the one that is circling around with the ribs. If this was our dissection, we had an actual name for this ventral ramus. Right? Remember this? This was the posterior between the ribs nerve. Remember that? Posterior intercostal nerve. Right? That's exactly what that one would be. So the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus are there everywhere. These run all the way from the 1st to the 31st spinal nerve. We have a dorsal and ventral ramus. If you think about the sacrum for a minute, remember the sacrum had holes in the front, pelvic foramina, and holes in the back, dorsal foramina? That was just for this. The dorsal ramus was coming out those dorsal foramina, and the ventral ramus was coming out the pelvic foramina. So you have this branching dorsal and ventral all the way down. Now if you look at the back, remember the back here? Remember the erector spinae? Remember all these little intertransversari, interspinales, rotatores, multifidus? Oh, that's a reach, isn't it? Try to reach back in your brain for this. Almost a third of the muscles in your human body are clustered around the spinal cord, around the vertebral column. And how do you innervate? Does every one of these muscles have its own little nerve, like the femoral nerve goes to the rectus femoris or the vastus lateralis? No. You know, when you think about this, you've got all of these muscles and all of these nerves. Here's kind of a picture of that. Let's just get right away what we know here. You can see the structure of the bones here. Here's the main parts of the body. There's the intervertebral foramen, right? You can see that the roots and the rootlets would be inside here. The spinal nerve is coming out right here, and you can see the spinal nerve branching. And this shows all 3 branches right here, we're focusing on the dorsal ramus right now, and you can see that dorsal ramus going into these erector spinae muscles. Now, all the way up and down, you know, think about it. 200 muscles, 62 spinal nerves. No one nerve necessarily for any one little muscle, just all of this complex connection. And you see when people have problems in their back, it's going to be incredibly complex. You know, if you had one little dorsal ramus go out, it would affect a muscle that would affect other muscles, that would affect your posture, that would, you know, could cause all sorts of problems. It's a very, very complex area. But it's the dorsal ramus of each and every spinal nerve that is working all of these muscles. You know how in the last 2 units, lower limb, upper limb, you've had a muscle list, and you've had all these nerves to remember? If we had done that with the torso, that column would have been really easy, right? All of those vertebral muscles would have simply been dorsal ramus, dorsal ramus, dorsal ramus, dorsal ramus, right? You know, if you really wanted to get detailed, you could say, oh, dorsal ramus of the C1 spinal nerve, dorsal ramus of the T5 spinal nerve, you know, kind of goes generally over here, but it's really too complicated in most ways to really get all of that type of detail. So that's the dorsal ramus, right? Arching into the back, working all of your back muscles and that kind of structure. Now the ventral ramus here is then the main body of the nerve that you and I think of that are the ones that we've talked about all semester. When we've talked about the lumbosacral plexus, those were formed by the ventral ramus of the L1 to L5 spinal nerves. Remember the lumbosacral plexus was L1 spinal nerve to S5, right? All of those nerves, their ventral ramus were the parts that were forming that lumbosacral plexus. Likewise, the ventral ramus up in your neck area were the portions of the nerve that was forming the brachial plexus. The dorsal rami were going off into the muscles in the back. The ventral ramus is the part of the nerve that forms the main body of the nerves that we've been talking about. So, and then, as you see here, this is in that thoracic area where the nerves just come straight out. There's no plexus here, right? Let's kind of put this all together. Hopefully you remember these 4 plexi. Right? Hopefully you remember all of these. These thoracic nerves are really the ones that we just really hadn't looked at yet. We looked at lumbo and sacral plexus, cervical and brachial. But this is a time you're going to have to do a little review. You're going to have to come back to this. You should know which spinal nerves form which plexus, right? The thoracic nerves would be the ones between here and here. So you'd say T2 to T12, right? So these are how the spinal nerves play out all the way down along with the spinal cord. Everybody good with that? Good so far? You know, again, most of what we have talked about in the past, we've just said spinal nerve, but we're really talking about the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve. So, and this picture just kind of illustrates that in this thoracic region. The thoracic nerves are the ones that we really haven't mentioned until now. And it's just, these are so simple because they're just those intercostal nerves. In the human being, we call them the posterior intercostal nerve, if you want to give them an exact name, because they're coming straight out of the posterior part of the human body. Okay, let's just mention briefly this third branch. I'm not going to do a lot of detail on it here. One of our lectures next week is going to talk about this third branch. Remember, the third branch is only found in a portion of the vertebral column. This is called the communicating ramus. Okay, the communicating ramus, and it's arching sort of in toward the body cavity. And this third branch is only found from T1 spinal nerve to the L2 spinal nerve. Nothing above that, nothing below that will have a communicating ramus. So if you just get that much detail right now, I can tell you this part of the nerve structure is what is flowing into your autonomic nervous system. Remember earlier this morning I said there's a somatic and an autonomic portion of your nervous system. The autonomic is the behind the scenes part of the nervous system, the one that's controlling your internal environment and any internal activities like digestion and breathing and things like that. So this branch is coming out into the thoracic cavity, and it's helping to coordinate some of that. So our autonomic lecture next week will have more detail on this communicating ramus. Okay, so not too difficult here, right? Dorsal and ventral ramus are the main ones that we're looking at here right now. So as we've got the spinal cord kind of in place, let's take just a few moments to look at spinal nerves, talk about those themselves in just a little bit more detail. Remember, spinal nerves are two-way streets. If you think of a nerve impulse like a car traveling along a road, if you look down at a freeway from way up above or up close, you see lots and lots of nerve impulses traveling lanes of traffic. And there's traffic in both directions. And that's got to be true for a spinal nerve. Right? In a spinal nerve, you're going to have traffic coming from, like if we're just talking about the main part of the body, you're going to have traffic coming from your skin, sensations that you're gathering through your skin, and there's got to be lanes of traffic that are carrying those nerve impulses up into the central nervous system. There are going to be separate lanes of traffic carrying signals from your brain down to your muscles to coordinate the movement of your body, and those are going to travel through separate lanes. Now, what are these lanes that we're speaking of that are found in a nerve? Well, let's look more closely at a nerve. If we take and put a nerve under the microscope and look at it closely, we see all these little strands. Every one of these little yellow tube-like, tiny little tube-like things you see here is what? Right? See the name way at the top? The axons of the neurons. Nerves are formed from axons. Now, do you remember what that is? Do you remember the neuron from our lecture last week? Right? Cell body, dendrites, and axons. Those are the three main parts of any neuron. The cell body is where most of the factory production life activity goes on. Dendrites are structures that receive impulses from other neurons or from sensory stimuli. Those are fed into the cell body, which uses all of that data to make some sort of a decision, and then it typically sends its signal to the next location through an axon. The axons can be very, very, very long. Those axons, as they're traveling to the next location, are typically bundled together, and that's what you see here. You see many, many axons from many, many neurons all bundled into packets because all of those in the same packet are traveling to the same destination. And if you were thinking of these, if you could look at these with an electrical vision, you would see little electrical impulses flowing through all those axons. Electrochemical impulses. And within a packet like this, all of those bits of traffic would be going the same direction. And maybe this packet over here, all the impulses are going another way. It's just like having two separate lanes of traffic on a freeway. So the nerve is a bundle of these axons, but the axons are in packets and tend to be, all the axons within a packet tend to be flowing the same direction. So some of these axons are going one direction and some of these are going the other direction. Now when you look at the bundling and packeting of these bundles of axons, this picture probably reminds you of something that we just recently studied. Here's a picture from the current textbook we're using that kind of shows the layout here of a nerve. In this case, the axons are yellow. They're insulated with these sort of purplish cells here. But does this remind you of something? Muscle fibers. Remember muscle fibers being bundled into a muscle? Well, guess what? Your human body uses the same pattern to bundle up its axons into nerves. So, the axons of the neurons here are bundled into packets. I bet you can guess, when we just took this test, I bet you can guess what the name above bundle of axons is. Okay? I've got many of you saying the right answer. It's a fasciculus. We're using the same terminology that we used with muscles. A bundle of muscle fibers is a fasciculus. A bundle of axons is a fasciculus. So a nerve generally contains many, many, many fasciculi of axons. And remember, one fasciculus here would be typically carrying nerve traffic in one direction, and another fasciculus over here is carrying nerve traffic in another direction. One of these is the sensory little fasciculus, and another is a motor fasciculus. So, we have fasciculi here. And then we're going to have the same bundling pattern. You see, if you learned this when we did the muscles, you're going to have an easy time here now. If somehow you ignored that or didn't learn it well, now you've got that much more to do. This is an investment, people. Everything you do here benefits your next class and benefits you somewhere else along the road here. Do you remember what the connective tissue, if this was a muscle fasciculus, do you remember what the connective tissue inside was called? Endomysium. See, some of you learned that. Endomysium. We're going to use the exact same pattern here. Only we're just going to change this one little bit in here. We're going to put ner in here to indicate that we're in a nerve. We used mys to tell us we were in a muscle, but this is endoneurium. Same pattern. And now, if you did learn it, you know the other two automatically, don't you? What is the connective tissue then that surrounds the fasciculus and keeps it structured as a fasciculus? That's called peri, right? Peri was the one that goes around the fasciculus. Peri is actually a word that means around. You know anything that starts with the word peri? Perineum? Perineum? Yeah, around your anal genital area. I always think of, we grew up with World War II movies and the submarine movies, right? When a submarine wants to look at, see what's going on up above, they look through a periscope, right? Because you could put it up and then, you know, the guys would be looking in like this and they could look all the way around, right? Peri means around. So this is the connective tissue around the fasciculus. Notice that these terms are generally in reference to the fasciculus. Right? So in the fasciculus, endoneurium, around the fasciculus, perineurium, and then epineurium would be used for the outside of the whole nerve, right? Epi is on the surface of something, right? So this is on the surface of the whole nerve, or if you want to say all the fasciculi together. So every time you study something, you do yourself a favor for your future. Some of us live day to day. If there's any way you can, live for your future. When you study, you build a future for yourself. If If you look at these under the microscope, you can actually see these connective tissues and the bundling and the axons and all of that there. Wanted to make reference here too to these axons running through nerves, because again there's an interesting medical thing going on here that would be helpful to understand. From time to time somebody loses a piece of a limb. This little article I took from a newspaper quite a few years ago now, I think, where a farmhand had been working with some big machine and got his arms caught in this thing, and it chopped off both arms right, across the forearm. Huge, just made all the headlines sort of, and was real big for a day or two. But people, some reporters went out and had kind of investigated this. Can you actually put those back on? Because they reattached his arms. Right? Our nervous system is so sensitive to oxygen that just a couple of minutes and your nervous system can die. But things like this, things like arms and legs and stuff like that, the tissues metabolize oxygen much more slowly, and things like your arm or your leg or a finger can survive for hours and hours, especially if you get it cold. If you get it cold, so you slow down all of that chemical activity, the oxygen and things are used up much more slowly, and residual amounts of ADP can continue to power cells slowly and keep them alive. So you get this guy's arms on ice as quickly as you can, and you rush him and his arms to the hospital, and you can put them back on. Now, you got to have a pretty good hospital and somebody that knows what they're doing. But you've broken bones, you've broken blood vessels, you've broken nerves, you've broken the skin, you've torn up muscles, right? Which of those do you want to reattach first? We're talking about nerves, so you think nerves. No, not nerves. Not bones. Blood vessels. I got to get life back into this thing, right? I got to get the source of nutrients and oxygen and all of that flowing back to these tissues to revitalize them, right? Well, the first thing you do is you get blood flowing back through this thing. Now the arm is stabilized and all the tissues hopefully are still alive. And now we can go about reattaching everything else. But let's get those blood vessels connected, right? Then we can go about, probably putting plates or screws or things back into the bones to get everything structured back together. Then we can sew up the muscles and all of that. The nerves are going to be one of the last things. Yeah, Jean?
How do they reattach them all together, like the nerves and the blood vessels? Because they're tubes, right?
Right. Yeah, you're just going to stitch. They've got special little stitching techniques to stitch those tubes right back together again. You're going to just cut off circulation up above the tube, and then you're going to sew the little tube back together and then let the oxygenated blood flow right back through. Yeah. So the nerves are going to come near the end, and there's a bigger problem with the nerves, right? Let's have a picture of a neuron. Now you think these axons are incredibly long that form these nerves. The cell body of a nerve that's connected to a muscle is up in your spinal cord. The cell body is in the spinal cord. The axon runs all the way out from the spinal cord to its connection. That's why these nerves are just big bundles of axons. So when you've injured this, and here I've got just a typical neuron. It's kind of short. This would be incredibly long. Let's put connective tissues over it. So let's pretend this is the epimysium, endomysium, perimysium, right? Now here comes the injury, right? Cuts the nerve into two. It's cut through the axon. Now one part of this neuron is going to live and the other part of this neuron is going to die, right? What's going to die? Right? This distal end, isn't it? This distal end is going to wither up and fall apart. The cell body is going to keep all of this alive. So I've got no connection to my muscles. Great, I've got a living arm back on here, but nothing works. So, as a surgeon, what do I want to do to give this person a chance? Well, it turns out this axon is going to grow again. The cell body here can make this axon grow. But this nerve was connected to a certain muscle in a certain place in my arm. How am I going to get this neuron to grow back where it was? This is where those connective tissues come in. This is why it's so important to understand perineurium, epineurium, and endoneurium. What the surgeon does, he doesn't care about the axon anymore. He goes in and finds these connective tissues, and if he can stitch the connective tissues in little tubes like the fasciculi, if he can stitch these back together, now when the axon grows, where is it going to grow? It's going to grow right down the connective tissue tube and right back to the same location that it was attached to before. So with a microscope, the surgeon's going to go in with a microscope and look at this nerve under the microscope and try to get as many of the little connective tissue things back together the way they were before. Pretty incredible, huh? And then this neuron is going to grow, and the chance of it attaching in exactly the same way to the same muscle fibers is remote. But when it grows back out here, it's going to be stimulated to attach itself to some muscle fibers. So you're going to have to relearn some coordination because things aren't going to be connected. And some things may not get back exactly where they need to go. There may be some problems here. But if I had both my arms chopped off and I got 70 or 80% of my function back, I think I'd feel blessed, right? Absolutely. So, understanding, when you see a simple nerve in the cat, or if you were to see one in a human being, you've got to think, I'm looking at all these axons that are connected to cells that are living in my central nervous system. And if those things get cut, connections are lost. And hopefully, things can regrow. And if you get a surgeon that can reconnect these connective tissues, you at least have a chance. All right. So last couple of things here. There's one special nerve. We've mentioned it before. We've actually found it in the cat, but I want to take a little bit more time with it. It's a spinal nerve. It's part of what we would call the cervical plexus. From the cervical plexus comes a very, very special nerve. Now, this nerve was one that affected breathing. Anybody remember us dissecting a nerve in the cat that affected breathing? Not vagus, but you're getting very, very warm. Right? Remember, this one was the nerve that was attached to the diaphragm. Remember? In here, vagus and the phrenic nerve. Remember the phrenic nerve? Well, it turns out we could follow it all the way through the thoracic cavity because it was formed all the way up here in my neck, way up in here. This is my connecting link to my diaphragm. It's called the phrenic nerve. It's formed by branches of the C3, C4, and C5 spinal nerve. The question is, why is an object, a muscle, so far away from my neck connected into my neck? Are there advantages? Is there some reason that I might have my breathing connected all the way up here? I mean, if the diaphragm's down here, why isn't it one of these deep thoracic nerves here coming out and putting its branches into the diaphragm and making me breathe? Well, it appears that the answer is, again, if you have some sort of a medical problem. If you have injury to your spinal cord, because it's a great big cable of axons and connecting links out into the structures of your body, anything that happens within the spinal cord is going to cut off nerve impulses to anything below the damage in the spinal cord. So you may even know somebody in a wheelchair who's paraplegic, likely has some damage down in the lumbar area of the spinal cord, right? So that impulses go down to there and then they don't go below that, and so you don't have connecting links down into the limbs anymore. Spinal cord is much more complex, okay? It's a lot more complex than a simple nerve. You break a nerve, you can put the connective tissues back together, but everything is just these simple little strands. In the spinal cord, you've got all these connections that can create difficulties. So everything below that is cut off. Well, if my breathing nerves were right here, then any damage from here to here would cut off my breathing. But with my breathing nerves connected all the way up here in my neck, I can be quadriplegic. If I have damage in the cervical area, it'll cut off all the movement from my neck down, except for one muscle, right? One muscle will continue to work. And that's called my diaphragm, right? Which is my everyday breathing. So even quadriplegics don't struggle for breath. It's the one muscle that still works. Why? Because structurally that nerve comes out from so high up in the neck. If you have a spinal cord injury above C3, then you've got big, big problems. That's called a hangman's fracture typically. And it's actually what the hangman's noose does in an execution. People think that hanging is to strangulate somebody. If it's done in a humane way, it's not. The rope is put very, very high up on the neck, right here, and the person is dropped from a platform so that when they reach the bottom of that rope, the rope, yanks them on the neck and actually fractures the vertebra and damages the spinal cord above C3. The shock makes the person go unconscious, but even while they're unconscious, the brain is sending signals to the diaphragm. But the signals can't get through because the spinal cord has been damaged above where the phrenic nerve is connected. Okay? And so that accounts for that means of execution, but it also accounts for some injuries too. If you think of a person that has this kind of an injury, here's what an X-ray would look like of that. It's going to be up around the atlas and axis, right? Here's what that X-ray looks like if you could look at it in more detail, right? Here's the atlas up here. Here's the axis with its dens going up inside the atlas. Here's the spinal cord surrounded by the posterior arch of the axis. And the break comes right through here. The C3 spinal nerve is coming out right here above the C3 vertebra. And so no chance for nerve signals to get to the diaphragm. Over the last number of years, the poster boy for this has been Christopher Reeve, who is dead now, but survived for years and years and years after this kind of an injury. When you saw him in a wheelchair like this, his neck was always covered because he didn't have the use of his diaphragm. So he had to have a respirator down here under the wheelchair, forcing air into his lungs because his diaphragm was not working. But when you think of how many years he survived and all the contributions that he continued to make even after he was injured, it's amazing. You don't have to totally lose hope even if you have this devastating an injury. He directed movies, he did philanthropic things, you could still dictate things and work a computer and all sorts of things just with the use of your head. But Every student of anatomy should know the phrenic nerve and where it comes from and implications on injuries in and around the neck area. Along with that, last topic here in this, should also know the concept of a dermatome. A dermatome. This plays, again, right into our spinal nerves. Derma sounds like skin, right? And a dermatome is just a patch of skin somewhere in your body that is all connected. Sensory information is all connected through a single spinal nerve. So, see this guy right here, they've laid him out so you can see he's got tattoos, doesn't he? He's got his whole body tattooed so you can see where the spinal nerves go, right? I love his attitude too, right? He's just letting it all hang out. I'm here, right? But if you look, like if you were to scratch your belly button, for instance, it appears that all of that scratching information is traveling the T10 spinal nerve to get back up into your brain. And your brain knows where you're scratching because these nerves, you know, as it's gained experience over time, it knows that when you scratch here, that's where you're scratching, right? You know, if you were to rub your shoulder, the C4 spinal nerve is carrying that sensory data into the brain. So all these big patches of skin are called dermatomes. And that would be a patch of skin whose sensations all travel a single spinal nerve into the central nervous system. What good is it to know this? Well, it's great for diagnosing spinal cord injuries, right? If you're a first responder, if you're on the scenes and you're not sure where the injury is to the person, you don't want to move them to find out, you simply touch their foot. Can you feel this? No. Can you feel this? No. Can you feel this? No. Can you feel this? Yes, I can. Oh, you can feel the front of your thigh, but you can't feel your knee or anything below that. Well, you can feel data coming through this L2 spinal nerve, but not through the L3 spinal nerve. So you know the damage is somewhere right in that area, right? So you can get a sense of what part of the spinal cord would have been damaged and what you really have to be careful with and stabilize as you move that patient to where they can be healed. Okay? You don't have to memorize this. You just need to know that this exists. And if you were a first responder, you know, in injuries, you'd probably want to know this. You'd either want to have a copy of this with you handy, or you'd want to go ahead and memorize this because it could prove useful if you were going to do this kind of medical work. Okay? Just make sure that you know what a dermatome is. I'm likely to ask you at least one question on the test about what a dermatome is. Okay? So, spinal cord, all of its major structures, the spinal nerves, how they form inside and how they branch outside, the different plexi and groups of nerves, and then make sure you know that phrenic nerve as well. A-okay? Good?